Now, when we talk about the transition from coal to oil, one of the things that's often misunderstood is that it's more than just changing fuel types. It's changing from a very mature, established set of infrastructure and supply lines to something which was having to be set up. In fact, you can argue that the biggest problem in World War One, when it comes to oil, was not supply, it was not even demand, it was transportation. It was the tonnage of tankers available. You had plenty of supply, you had plenty of demand. You didn't have enough tankers, you didn't have enough of the infrastructure needed to maneuver it. And despite the fact it never got as bad as sometimes history claims, I've seen some reports saying the Royal Navy was down to, you know, a week's worth of oil at times. No, they were never down that low. No. 4 months was the lowest they're predicting they were going to go down to. And you have to remember, Jellicoe is sort of giving the most pessimistic figures he can. And the reason he's giving these most pessimistic figures is because the War Office's figures are sufficiently ebullient to make you think that there is no submarine sinking any oil tankers in the world at that time, and the government and both the British and American governments were similarly inclined to a more pleasant view of the world. Jellicoe gets a hefty reputation for being a pessimist post-war, especially amongst the political classes pushing him out. But realistically, that's because he's often having to push the data and pick the worst scenarios and the worst potential outcomes in order to shock the politicians into doing things. But the important point there is to remember that the Royal Navy was always looking at predicting its fuel quantities 12 months in advance based on fuel usage. And at one point in 1916, they predict that in 1917 they could go down to just 4 months worth of fuel in reserve. They never actually get down to 4 months worth of fuel in reserve because they take action, they remedy it, and at no point are they ever usually less than they have usually less than 6 months fuel in reserve. So the thing is, when someone turns around and goes, "Oh, the Royal Navy at points in World War One, they had no fuel, they had nothing," I'm sort of going, they had 6 months reserve sitting in the British Isles alone. That's before we start including all the bases they have around the world. There's a difficulty here with going, they didn't have enough. And then, of course, you have to consider that the Royal Navy post World War Two, how they get involved in the infrastructure and building up the oil capacity. Well, again, that takes two folds. You've got the government, which seems to pursue, this is post World War One actually, they pursue a policy of what matters is the oil companies are British, because then they'll make sure we get some oil. The Royal Navy would really like the government to pursuing a policy of making sure we have enough tankers which are British flagged, so we can definitely call upon them. That's not really a possibility. So the Royal Navy instead goes, let's skew the data so we can maximise our own storage because we can't trust the government to actually buy the frigging tankers. And if you look what happens to their oil tankers, they're one of the same people who always talks about how pro-oil and how important it was, Winston Churchill, is one of the people who is very happy with the idea and actually proposes and pushes it, the idea of converting their fast fleet oilers into amphibious warfare ships, carrying gantries with landing craft on them. And then you have some historians, often who haven't done a study, will turn around with a straight face and tell you the Royal Navy had played no thought to the reality of refueling at sea or oiling their ships in the 1920s and 30s and were completely stuck in the past. And it's just not the case. But one of the reasons you can make that case is because very few people have done the depth of study which Warwick Michael Brown did. He did this brilliant PhD thesis, and I love this sort of punch Punch comic which comes from it, which is basically that the Britannia's been, when King Cole wasn't available, Britannia went to go and dance with Prince Petroleum. It makes sense, but I have to admit, this PhD thesis is one of the theses which my supervisor, Andrew Lambert, when I did my PhD, recommended to me to read. And I read it, and I looked at it and went, but there are so many books which claim differently. And it has a great line in it, a line which I myself have to say I drew as an homage at times. Fuel, and this is in the opening introduction, fuel is given scant attention by most naval historians. Indeed, the only study that specifically examines British naval fuel during the First World War contains a number of major inaccuracies. So brief and slipshod appearance does fuel make in most works of naval history that they are often not misleading. They do afford a useful contextual backdrop, as well as providing technical and statistical information. That is the phrase in why I have not bothered much with secondary sources or things written by other people. It's quite bad when you look at some of the books listed in here and this author and Brown's opinion of them. And I do agree with Brown. When I went and did some checking, because of course I was looking at naval aviation, and fuel didn't come up as much of a topic in my thesis, but I needed to know it to understand the background of what's going on, so I could judge the information appropriately. And I had to go and study it quite in depth. And one of the reasons why this proved so useful and why this PhD thesis stuck with me, was because of its source list and going and checking its sources and checking them against the major works which have been done on fuel, especially. And it's when you're looking at the works and you're going, I don't know where you're getting this information from, because it's not backed up by any of the primary sources which I can find. I can find the primary sources which back up his work. And you end up finding it's a combination of, well, this was the opinion, this is the political statement, this is this. Those don't add up. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, when it comes to the history of fuel consumption, especially within World War I, you will find a massive difference between the Admiralty figures over what they're doing, what they're predicting, what they're putting forward on the Jellicoe, and what are the War Office official figures, which seem to be the ones which run rampant round post-World War and post-World War. And there are various reasons for that. But as said, the War Office, even in the middle of the war, the Prime Minister was known to say to the War Office, so, this data, did you make it up completely, or is there a tangent of truth in there somewhere? They were known to make the data fit, and the statistics fit what they wanted it to say. Not always in the best way. And they had an argument, they made the data fit the argument first. And it wasn't all officers, and I'm not saying the Navy was entirely blameless in this as well, because once the Navy cottoned onto it, as said, Jellicoe was picking out the worst case scenario to shock them. So the thing is, you can argue that the War Office got there first and realised they needed to do that if they wanted to give themselves a good case to argue for funding, argue for the things they needed to do. Navy took longer to work it out. You can say it's the benefit of having staff officers. I don't know, but the fact is, that means when you're looking in the actual statistics and you're looking for the actual primary data, you have to dig far deeper than necessarily what is being fed to Cabinet. Far, far deeper. And Brown did this. Massively. And it's worthwhile hunting down, by the way. You can find it on the website to go look at. So, when I'm usually introducing people to this topic and discussion, I usually start by opening up Admiral Sir Reginald Hugh Spencer Bacon's Some Notes on Naval Strategy from 1901 in the Brassies. It's a good read. Again, you can find it to read it online completely free. There is apparently a copy which you can get that looks like this one. And I say there's a copy you can get which looks like this one because I've had it on order for a good few years and it hasn't come yet. So 1901 is one of the ones I don't have. I have 1902, I have 1900, I do not have 1901. This annoys me, but I will get over it, and I will keep hunting through second-hand stores. Now, what this says, and by the way, I've got 3 slides of this because I wanted to go through all this and annotate it. I'm going to expand so you can properly read, and I'm going to discuss what he's saying. Because it's important to realise that this is someone who's part of the Royal Navy's thinking force. Part of their officers who are actually imagining the future, who are looking for the future tactics. And these are the words he's writing in brassies, which is... how do I put this polite? The public-private interface of naval communications, where it's acceptable to discuss these things and air them, as long as you can put them in the context of current efforts and history. And that's what he does. And he does it well. He does it really well. So without much further ado, let's expand and start off on the first page. So let us start off with the corner. If you notice on page... I think it is 245. You'll notice there's a little a line on the side. Now, this was an old style of in books. They used to have, especially in books like the Brassies, where they'd have a little sort of snippet in the margin, which would give you a heads up. This is going to be this section. This is what this section is about. And instead of giving a section, subtitle, etc., you have these little sort of snippets in the margins, and it's a really cool way, and something which I wish we brought back, but having spoken with publishers, etc., the realities of printing, it's not going to happen anytime soon, because it makes it very difficult. I am trying to see if I can get it to work in my self-published book, but we'll see what we can do. We'll see what we can do. And this section is called The Factor of Naval Mobility. So far, the broad outlines of strategic operations have been the same for each service, but when we leave mere principles and come to consider strategic operations due to the physical features of a geographical area, we must necessarily find considerable modification necessary, chiefly owing to the enormously increased rate of travel of ships compared with armies, and the sameness of the sea providing no physical advantage or disadvantage to either force, unless you're a force which is designed to operate in the Mediterranean and you find yourself in the North Atlantic. Then there's a very, very physical, geographical reason you are going to be in trouble. Now, a battleship squadron has no line of communications when proceeding from base to base. It is analogous to a flying squadron ashore. It is self-contained. When on the warpath, its movements are unhampered by communications, but the intra-communication of its bases must, within limits, be assured. In other words, if you're going to use these as logistical facilities, you basically need to have good communications between the bases to support the logistics of your naval operations. Because especially when you're coaling ships, you're doing that inside a base. You're doing that in a place where you can stop the ship. Because coaling a ship requires all sorts of support, all sorts of infrastructure. Again, there is no such thing as fatigue, nor is a rest from motion required to a fleet, within the limits of its coal endurance. For these two reasons, a naval force is extremely mobile, and strategic alterations in this position can be made with far greater rapidity and secrecy than is possible ashore. What is interesting is this is still the case to this day. People often go, well, what about satellites? Well, yes. If you have satellites, you can watch, but you might not get the right information depending on where the satellite is. Do you have enough satellites to provide total coverage totally around the world 24 hours a day? If you do, great. But even then, that can be confused, or the satellites can be discombobulated in some ways, or discontinued in others. Land forces often face trouble because they're moving through populations, and populations make noise, for starters. These days, with things like mobile phones, always useful, but that means that very quickly your movements can be picked up. You know, how often do you see things of people putting on videos of, look, this is the US Army are moving this armoured vehicles through America. They're preparing for this sort of civil war, that sort of war. And you're going, they're not. That's just the normal movement of vehicles from maintenance to the bases they operate with the troops and back again. Or they're moving because they're moving units around for exercises and these things. So the forces just get moved around. That's the same in the UK, but in the UK it kind of gets less attention because honestly, the bases are kind of concentrated in certain areas, and when we do see the things moving, it's a, oh my! Done. Because it's a couple of vehicles, or it's a couple of lorries, or it's a small road convoy. Very rarely is it the full brigade's worth of kit being moved in one go on one train, which does look like a, oh my lord, that's a lot of equipment. You can understand it. But ships, think about the last time someone posted a video of a ship moving around in the middle Atlantic and going, it's gone from here to here. No one knows. Now, there are choke points it can go through. Gibraltar. Suez. You know, there are lots of them around the world. Singapore. We want to go through Gallipoli, i.e. the Dardanelles. We want to go into the Baltic, where you're probably going to get spotted, and it's probably going to get talked about. So it is a problem for ships as well, far more than it used to be. But to be fair, those positions have always been problems where, since there's been things like the telegram, there's been the ability of people there to go, I have spotted a ship moving. It's still a good rule of thumb that it is going to be a greater strategic surprise how quickly ships arrive in an area than is going to be any other forces. Quite literally because of how they get there and how self-propelled they are. It's still the case to this day. Then we go to the next one, which is this page, or rather pages, 246 and 247, so a lot more to discuss here. Now, again, from the sides, you can see there are various topics we're going to be doing, but we're going to start off by finishing off the factor of naval mobility. And as Bacon goes on with, the extent of such alterations, again, is immense. A fleet disappearing in China might turn up with equal ease in Australia, or the Pacific coast of America, or in the East Indies. The force from one theatre of operations might change its position to another, and effect in a junction with a fleet there, with astounding secrecy and rapidity. The limitations to such movements ashore are physical obstructions, muscular weariness, and transport. Afloat, the limitation is coal consideration. This gives rise to the principle which, for want of a better name, must be called coal strategy. In other words, if you haven't realized it, the essence of all naval warfare is logistics. The fleet which has the supplies can do the operations, and can therefore turn up where it needs to operate. The fleet which doesn't have the supplies is trapped and moribund. So then we get into coal strategy, and Bacon has some interesting ideas on that. If ashore, a soldier be given 4 days' rations to consume in one, he'll probably go half as fast that day. At sea, ships go twice the speed. We have at sea command of very high speeds, but we pay a ruinous price for the luxury. Provided we have the choice of speed, we can steam long distances. But if we are hustled, if desire of evasion or other dire necessity increases our rate of travel, we draw heavily on the distance we can steam. A fleet with many coal bases can, therefore, hustle another into inability to proceed to other than certain destinations. Without overtaking or forcing a general action, we can, to use an Irishism, head off the fleet from astern. Now, this is a very clever point, and it's a very true point. If you have enough fuel supplies, and you have enough easy access to them, you can keep pushing the enemy till they run out of fuel, and are forced to fight you. You can push the enemy so they can't reach their destination, because if they have so much fuel, let's say they have 10 days steaming at 18 knots, and you're pushing them to go ahead at 21 knots. Now, you might think, well, Alex, that's only sick faster. You know, that's what that's going to do. That's going to take their steaming down by a day and a half. Actually, it's probably going to be more like taking it down by 2 to 3 days. And whilst they're going faster, are they going fast enough that in those 2 to 3 days they're going to that even without those 2 to 3 days they're going to cover the same amount of ground and get to where they wanted to go? Probably not. This also explains why the Royal Navy is so concerned with having necessary infrastructure around the world, with having necessary supplies, and why the debate to take or to transfer over to oil from coal is such a heated one. It's not just because of the quality of coal, it's not just because of the maturity of the coal, it's the maturity of the coal supplies, maturity of the infrastructure, maturity of what they have available, which allows them to do this to enemy fleets. Transitioning to oil is going to require building all that infrastructure up, and you're going to have to do it anyway because you want the higher speeds, and oil is far easier to use. But the pace of that transition, the time you're going to be able to enable it, how much it's going to cost, these are all going to be factors you're going to have to deal with. So coal versus oil are both factors. Now, this is mainly talking about coal. This analysis, this naval annual, this section is the importance of the coal question. But what's really interesting is when you then look at the debate which was starting in about oil at this point, starting and realistically to taking off in 1900, 1901, you start looking at it and you go, hang on, this applies to oil, doesn't it? Because in a nice way, you're talking about all this infrastructure you need, etc. The Royal Navy already has this for coal. You're pointing out the infrastructure it already has for coal, which we know about. So in a way, what you're pointing out is this is the infrastructure we need to replicate for oil. If you consider the modus operandi of how they work in the annuals, that is exactly what was going on. And the naval officers at the time will have known enough to be able to read between the lines. They'll be able to read this and look at this and go, oh, that's what Bacon's talking about. Rather than getting into the debate, he's dropping a bombshell on the debate and setting its frames of reference. Now, as it continues on, the limitation of distance capacity, this invisible control over the destination of an enemy, is a point worthy of great consideration since it gives a new meaning to the word blockade. It confers new powers on a superior fleet, in touch with but out of sight of an enemy. Nor is it in strategy only that the question of coal and its supply have place. Tactics at times may largely be dictated by coal considerations, but this is beyond the present question. It's always great when someone puts that beyond the present question, because it's phrasing the things. It's going, look, there's this point over here, which we've got to consider, but I'm not touching on it now. But you're going to want to think about that. Because again, if you've got ample coal supply, you can do high-speed tactical maneuvering. If you haven't, well, as anyone who's played the game Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts will realise, when the ships are at the end of their fuel capacity, they're suddenly slower, they aren't able to maneuver as well, and all the other things, and that is a factor to them. That is a very realistic factor to have in there. A very realistic factor. It may be suggested that supplies of coal should always be carried with a fleet. Food for the soldiers is carried by the commissariat. Why not carry coal? Why not carry food for the ships? In suitable vessels, so as to replenish their bunkers when required. That coal can be carried with a fleet and distributed under certain conditions is obvious. But to count upon such a supply as being generally possible, and to place reliance on such replenishment being always available, is quite out of the question. Well, there is the Great White Fleet to look at. There is other scenarios going on. Later on, the Russians going to Tsushima. It's difficult. You might want to bring the coal with you, but you can't always get it there. You need to rely on other sources. Now, that ships will, on occasion, have their bunker filled at sea is probable, and even at times a necessity, but the possibility of such replenishment must not be looked on as a general operation of wartime. To appreciate this fully, let us compare the feeding of bunkers with the feeding of troops, and consider the transport required, and the subsequent disposal of transport, as well as the time available for distributing coal in localities where such distribution is possible. On all these points we shall find greater difficulties attending supply of coal than of provisions ashore. First of all, the rate of transport must be equal to the speed of the fleet. Consequently, the coal consumption of the colliers will be comparable with that of a man of war of equal tonnage. To make her own coal consumption negligible compared with her carrying capacity, the collier must be very large. But a very large collier is inconvenient to coal from even in close harbours. The difficulty again of the disposal of colliers after use has to be considered. Either they must steam under convoy, or at high speed to some base, which necessitates the use of coal, or they must remain with the fleet and keep coal equal to that possessed by a ship of the fleet. Both these difficulties are analogous to the porterage of water with a column in a country where none is available. When the carriers themselves have to drink of the actual loads they are carrying, and as each man's load is finished, he becomes useless and wasteful to the column. Then either the range of action of the column is limited, or they must be sent back to the base. All who have had to deal with this class of self-wasting porterage know that its employment is only practicable under dire necessity, and is always a matter of difficulty and of incipient danger. And, by the way, this is an issue we still deal with to this day. We're always going to deal with it. And it's an issue for when you want fast mobile forces ashore as well, on land. The vehicles, the tankers, need their own fuel. They're not just bringing fuel, they're consuming fuel as they're bringing it. And if they've got weapons to protect themselves, they're probably consuming ammunition as well as bringing it as well. They need to. They have to. But it's got to be a factor in your logistics operations. It's why when someone goes, well, we are supplying a battalion of troops forward, and this is... Why do we have to take so many supplies to do it? Well, you're not just supplying a battalion of troops to forward. You're supplying the convoy, the column, that's taking the supplies to them and and coming back to you. So you have to factor that into your supplies as well. This is one of the reasons why, when I talk about the tail growing ever longer, the more you want to do with the teeth arm, this is one of the reasons why. The more you want to do with the teeth, the more the tail scales up, because distance is a factor. But not just distance in terms of distance they're having to carry it to rearm them, but also distance in terms of they're having to carry it. It's going to be a factor to supplies. It all adds up. It's all there. It all matters. And then we go from there. Now, in addition to these two conditions, we have two others to take into consideration, namely the waste of time in distributing the coal, and the difficulty of finding a suitable place where it may be required to effect the coaling. These have no counterpart in land operations, where the daily bivouac supplies both, but at sea, to coal a large fleet from colliers of requisite size to be averagely economical would either entail a very large number of such vessels, or occupy a great time, and moreover, a time entirely lost to the operations in view and perhaps not incurred by the imposing fleet. The difficulty of suitable position for the operation precludes the attempt in certain waters, while in others convenient places may be relied on. This condition is entirely meteorological and geographical. The separate difficulties of each of the above considerations apply to special and different conditions. It is therefore impossible to integrate and say generally that coaling at sea is possible or impossible, but it is quite safe to predict that there are occasions where coaling on sea will be systematically carried out, and that as assuredly others exist under which it will be extremely rash to put any reliance on the possibility of such an undertaking. And by the way, this becomes a big factor in transitioning to oil, because oil you can refuel at sea a lot quicker than coal. You can refuel at sea a lot quicker than coal. It's still not quick, it's still not easy. But you can do it a lot easier than you can coal. It makes it far more practicable. And it's a factor as you start thinking about a global empire, as you start thinking about the realities of the British Empire and its global presence. Now, maintenance of coal supply, either by economy or replenishment, is as strategically important to the Navy as a commissariat is to an army in the field. The difficulties of maintaining the supply and the dangers in case of failure are equally grave. Moreover, let us remember that although hundreds of years of experience have ground this danger into military thought and disposition, with the Navy it is the mushroom growth of yesterday. And no experience in past wars exists to warn us of the risking failure from this cause. Careful thought analogy, secondly, soundly applied, are our only helps. The lessons to be learned from the failure of competent forecast lie in naval wars of the future. See, the thing is, that's to an extent true, but not quite true. In Age of Sail, you often had to replenish the fleet at sea, but food and water. Now you're having to add fuel. The thing is, though, as long as you had food and water, you could sail as far as you wanted. And it didn't. You didn't use up sails. Unless they got shot off by an enemy. Sails were a reusable resource. Fuel is interesting because for the navies, they've just kept feeding their sailors the same amount per day and, watering them, making sure they're okay. You can predict that. That's going to be very stable. But if you want to go fast, you're going to use up fuel more quickly. If you want to go longer range, you're going to have to move slower. Probably. This is both the same as resupplying the fleet in Napoleonic periods and at the same time incredibly different because of its strategic and tactical components on terms of your energy supplies and your ability to actually operate your ships. But of course it doesn't stop there, it's carrying on, and we're going to do at least another next section as well. Now this, of course, is advantages and disadvantages of physical condition. In the absence of physical advantages and disadvantages, we find the sea one vast tract. No limitation due to the width of roads, no bridges exist, and exceedingly few passes, and these mostly of such a size as to render it impossible for a fleet to traverse them unobserved by night or in thick weather. The result is that all stratego-tactical operations, I do love strategico-tactical operations, it's such a lovely phrase. It's one of those many different phrases you have going around in this period, and there are certain phraseologies which only turn up in the 20s, 30s, and there are certain phraseologies which turn up in the 1900s and 1910s, and you start to realize that this language really does keep evolving and keep changing, and the modern versions of the words, the modern phraseology is not the way it was always necessarily before, and sometimes the very phrasing of these words and their meaning will actually change over time. Such as scouting, reconnaissance, or rearguard actions are rendered extremely difficult. We have only in place of these physical obstructions the alternations of light and darkness. The diurnal changes are of great importance, for although not directly reducing the travelling power of the fleet, they absolutely limit visibility, and therefore efficiency of scouting. Also the fact that the destructive value of certain vessels depends solely on the screen afforded by such darkness, and that they rely on nightfall for the full exercise of their function, renders this period one of danger, and imposes the utmost caution on the movements of a fleet. The rearguards of a fleet do not, like those of any army ashore, look for help from ranges of hills or passes or natural barriers on which to rest and gain advantage of position, but from the covering cloak of darkness, fully developing the offensive value of the small craft, by, in the like ratio, reducing the defensive powers of the larger vessels. But the effect of the alternations of light and darkness on strategic tactics is far too large a subject to do more than a mention in these notes. Its effect is marked on every page in naval history, but of late years its potency has increased in direct proportion with the facilities and improvements of the age. Regarding the strategico-tactical portion of a campaign, a naval theatre of war would compare the military one consisting of a huge, irregularly shaped plain bounded by water with fortresses on the shore. This plain traversed by flying columns able to move to the visible horizon in half an hour. Fog, rain, and long hours of darkness are the principal varying factors, and when associated with great speed of movement, are paralyzing obstacles to scouting and observation. And there we go. Now, it then goes on with lessons from the defense of Natal and various other things, but it's worthwhile considering these words. There is a reason I collect these books. There is a reason whether they're the newer published versions or the originals, which I luckily have a few, there's a reason I collect them. Because they give a fascinating guide to development of thinking at the time. And rather like that wonderful thesis which I pointed to earlier by Brown, they give you a very different story of developments at a time and understanding of time, and then necessarily we get from what we see in some of the books which have been published, out on the subject, or actually have gone through the subject. Because often those books have looked at it from the angle of looking back, or they have looked at it from the sources they have gone and found, which have often been the surface sources, because it's part of their topic, it's not their whole topic. And it's only when you look at something like fuel supplies in its full depth that you are going to be given the advantage of having the time, luxury some would argue, of being able to go and investigate the full sources and the deep sources. The levels below what you get in that maybe in National Archives, or the information you get beyond that from the cabinet papers. It's that case. Sorry, I have a poodle who is asking to go in the garden, but luckily we have just reached this page. Now, before we get into the full discussion that's going to happen after of the transition, after the Shameless book plug, we've got to consider the fact that this is all a debate about logistics. And it's about people's appreciation and understanding of the realities of why Britain had evolved the way it had. Britain was a global maritime trading empire, nation, long before it hit the 19th century, the 1800s, long before the Battle of Trafalgar. And what you see through the 1800s, after the Battle of Trafalgar, as you have what is often called the Age of Imperialism, is Britain going through almost a century of setting up coaling bases, stations. Yes, India is the East India Company and there are others, but when you start to look at Africa, when you start to look at certain parts of the world, what the Royal Navy is really looking for are coaling bases. What the government is looking for are coaling bases. When we talk about coal, when we talk about its legacy with Britain, it's the coaling bases. It's the bases set up to provide that sustenance to the Royal Navy and its global operations capability. That are the infrastructure which underpin its performance in 2 world wars, which give it global reach, which give it the capability to exercise its power and utilize its naval power on the global stage without fear of impediment by any others. And often it was the securing of these stations, these places where they could fuel their ships, which led to the growth of empire, because first you build the station, then someone else decides to take a place not too far away. Now you need to secure the interior, the landward border of that station, to provide it with defensive depth. And so you find yourself with an empire, because as your landward border expands, so does your oppositions and counterparts and people who can cause you trouble, and the points of friction and the points of advantage, and so on and so on. Realistically, Britain's empire most of the time was about building the naval equivalent of the motorway filling station. That was it. They weren't looking for an empire. They were looking for a motorway filling station, which turned into an entrepot of trade, which turned into something we have to protect itself because it's intrinsic value, which turns into we have an empire. Because either we take this territory or the French will. And that becomes a problem. Human competition again, writ large. So seeing the debate about oil versus coal and the discussions which are had of it, you have to realise that you have almost a century of infrastructure build up supporting the coal industry. You have colliers, you have various systems for actually loading coal aboard ships, various specialist cranes, etc., in different harbours and floating versions around the world that can assist in coaling ships. You have none of this infrastructure for oil. When you're looking at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, and you're talking about the transition to oil, this is the problem you've got to deal with. And by the way, it does have resonance today, because when you look at the thing of filling our cars up, they run on mostly petrol or diesel. Look at the different issues we're having transitioning to other fuel sources, whether it's batteries, hydrogen, whatever we decide that we eventually transition to. It's all about implementing the infrastructure. It's all the cost. Think of how many times you hear those debates, those huge numbers. Well, go back and look into the costs of changing ships over from coal to oil. And by the way, adjusted for inflation, the figures aren't too far dissimilar. They aren't too far apart. So this was a huge expense. So it needed to be sure it worked. You need to be sure it was the right thing, because let's be honest, one of the reasons why governments have all been so reticent about jumping into the new energy sources, they're not sure which is going to win. Is it going to be batteries? Is it going to be hydrogen? Are they going to have to implement it themselves, or will companies implement it for them? Will the private market free market take care of it? Or do governments need to underpin its transition to an extent to get it started? That's always a real problem. Because often when we look at it, it's governments which take the great leap, because they can afford to absorb the loss if it goes bad, and then companies build up the things afterwards. That has always been the historic case. Even when you're talking about exploration, it was governments which found the route first, or kings and queens who sponsored the routes. Once the routes were found, then the businesses would come in and go, oh yeah, we'll pay for an expedition. Now we know there's something there. Now we know we can get there. Yeah, now we'll fund the stuff which builds upon that discovery. It's the same with setting up these global supply stations for the Royal Navy. Often these positions were set up by the government for government interests, and then the companies came in and started turning things into the financial circumstances they would become. It was after the government had already got that. And so you've got to put the oil versus coal debate in context of the infrastructure and operations debate. That's always the reality. It has to be infrastructure and operations as a key part of the coal versus oil debate. Next thing is the realization that you're not going to do this quickly. You are not going to shove from one to the other and change all the ships overnight. Even Britain, with the production capacity they had, couldn't afford that. Now, I'm not saying they couldn't. If they believed it was necessary, they wouldn't have done that. We're talking about a navy which literally took ships off the line in the middle of the height of the Napoleonic Wars to copper bottom them, because of the advantages it would give them. So if you could sell them on the advantages enough, if you could tell them this is going to be advantageous enough, they would do that. But they'd have to believe it was going to be advantageous enough to justify it, to do such a quick transition. With that being said, though, shameless book plug time. So the advantage of a shameless book plug is it's the point at which I can say thank you for supporting the channel, thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing, thank you for helping the channel grow, thank you for helping me reach more people with a love of naval history. It's also where I can shamelessly plug my book, which as an academic I have to, because it's how we get judged and promoted and all those things. And I would like a pension at the moment. The other option is to try and grow the YouTube channel to the point at which it's not only funding research, but also allows me to fund invest a bit in a private pension. So, you know, I'm happy either way, but I'd like to not be just relying on just the state pension when I retire. It always seems to be a political basketball. But leaving that to one side, thank you for your support. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for all the things you do to help the channel grow. And I hope you enjoyed these Patreon premieres, because I find them pretty cool. I've saved both for this week because this is the week I'm travelling. And so they're coming out on the Thursday and they're coming out on the Friday away. And there's also a video coming out on Saturday. And if I've got time this evening, I might even get Scuttlebutt 9 finished off and have that go out on Wednesday. Might not. You'll know if it's come out because it will come out before this video. But in order of priorities, it was make sure the Patreon premieres were done, and make sure the Tuesday and Saturday videos were done, and then finish off Scuttlebutt 9, because Scuttlebutt 9 has expanded it, because there's actually some tweets in it this time, because people were tweeting at me questions, and I went, okay, I'll do a fuller response in Scuttlebutt 9. And yeah, so Scuttlebutt series is turning into my general answer all questions and also comments which are interesting on the channel videos. At a certain point, I've got to resist the urge to start picking random things people say on Twitter and just go, so this person was being a bit silly, because that's a bit cruel. It's tempting. Anyway, HMS Spiteful. Now, this logistics factor becomes even more of a compounding, part of the equation when we start to realise the testing that goes on with Spiteful and against her sister Peterel. When she's converted in 1904, what they're doing is testing out how oil-burning ship versus coal-burning ship works, and they find that A, she's producing no more smoke with some suitable modifications. It's found also that the ship's crew can be reduced because you don't need so many people to crew the boiler rooms. The stokers aren't laboriously actually shoveling in the coal. They are monitoring, they are controlling everything, they're carefully judging everything still, but there's not as much physical labour going on, so they don't need so many of them. Peterel had required 6 stokers for the trials. Spiteful required only 3 boiler room crew. Peterel's crew had to get rid of 1.5 tons of ash and clinker. Spiteful produced no ash and no clinker. And whilst Peterel took 1.5 hours to prepare for steaming, Spiteful took 10 minutes. This was the important thing. And from that point on, Spiteful is used by the Admiralty to train crews in oil-burning equipment. They are there because it is necessary. They are there because it is useful. Now, Bacon, of course, had discussed all the things about coal strategy. He brought all that up. Well, oil removes some of those issues. And oil is the basis for that. The issues it removes are it reduces the number of crew, which extends your existing food supplies. Because if you think about how many boiler rooms you have, if you cut 3 people from every single one of the boiler rooms, that's suddenly an appreciable drop of crew numbers. An appreciable drop in terms of consumption and other things you need to sustain and support. As also, you don't need to remove the clinker and ash. The ship isn't going to get as dirty. If the ship's not getting as dirty, then that also removes issues for the crew and allows them to focus on other things, which means you again can reduce numbers. And naval operations is about logistics. So the fuel, oil, is both easier in terms of logistical methodologies of moving and changing between ships, because you pipe it across to a ship rather than having to crane it across. You can pipe and continuously sustain until you top up the tanks, and you can pipe it into one point and automatically have it transferred by pipes through to those positions, rather than having to laboriously man pack the coal around the ship to where it needed to be. You don't have to have stokers whose job is to literally move coal from one bunker to another bunker to maintain the balance of the ship. You can do that with pipe work, with the oil. So you can reduce not only the logistical burden imposed by your fuel supplies, but also the logistical burden of the personnel required to sustain that fuel. And all these things are big factors in naval operations. All of them have an effect. And all of it builds up. Now, we've considered this testing is going on, and the ideas have been around since about 1901. You start to realize that when the Royal Commission on Fuel and Engines is set up between 1911 and 1915, run by Jackie Fisher, it is pretty much a foregone conclusion of what's coming. The main reason the commission's been set up is to provide the political coverage and the necessary ammunition needed to win the debate, and to justify the cost, because the problem you're going to have is not changing to oil for new ships. It's all this infrastructure. This is going to be your problem. You have this infrastructure, you have everything set up for coal. And that's the real problem we see in World War I when we're talking about it, because we'll talk through the recommendations of the commissions and what they did, but what is worthwhile noting is that a lot of the problems caused in World War I, a lot of the projected shortages, etc., were caused because the infrastructure hadn't been completed yet. The infrastructure had not been fully installed. The Royal Navy had been building infrastructure, they'd been working on infrastructure. They hadn't yet managed to implement it completely. And the Royal Commission on Fuel Engines is part of that process. This is why I say often World War I, World War II happen in interesting times. They don't happen at times when you're dealing with mature technologies fighting each other. Both of them happen at times of technological transition. And there's almost something of that which is in the zeitgeist as a factor for a global war. You're talking about a time of technological transition, when everyone knows that the major powers who invested in their technology, invested in infrastructure, are reliant on those things, are having to make a choice between whether to fund the next generation systems and invest in that, or continue funding the existing systems. Now, prior to World War I, honestly, the British are hedging their bets and are funding them through because they're having to fund the transition. In World War II, what is that transition we're talking about? You're starting the transition process from being governed by the range of guns to being governed by other methods of delivering those shells. And again, I know people don't always like me saying this, but bombs from aircraft are shells which are delivered by a different methodology. That's realistically what they are in terms of naval warfare terminology. And when you add on missiles, well, that's self-propelled shells delivered by aircraft or from ships. Again, it's shells by a different methodology. You have extended the range of your artillery, and it's usually the longer range, more accurate artillery which wins the fight, which is what eventually transitions and why carriers take over from battleships as the premier capital ship and all these things. But that's beginning to really become a potential viability in the late 1930s. We're talking 1937-38. and was actually only really a viability after the maturation of and a lot of money put into bringing certain technologies which had already been developed but hadn't yet been implemented into actual practicable operation during World War II. It's coming, but it hadn't been there before the war. And that's like this you're dealing with in this instance. The time of oil is coming in 1911. It's coming in 1900, 1901. We can all see it's coming. But it's not there yet. The testing hasn't been done, the infrastructure isn't in place, all these things haven't been set up, which you need to have done for it to actually viably work. Which is why the selection of the commissioners for the Royal Commission is quite so interesting. We have Winston Churchill, of course, is in his role as First Lord of the Admiralty, I mean, establishes them. He picks John Fisher, who's a former First Sea Lord. Sorry about that misspeak there. I've got two names up on my list next to me, and I'm bound to pick them. Not pictured, of course. George Lambert, who was a pretty interesting gentleman and a member of Parliament. He's not pictured here. We have Sir Thomas Boverton Redwood, who, well, if I read out his letters after his name, he's FRSE, FIC, FCS, FGS, FRSA, and MIME. That's basically most of those F stands for fellow of the whatever. He's a chemical engineer and is an absolute godsend to the British petroleum industry. He's also a really, really first-class mind. You have Philip Watts, a well-known naval architect who, of course, been critical for things like the Ellsworth cruisers and HMS Dreadnought. Henry John Oram, John Jellicoe, who basically Fisher considered the smartest guy he had access to. Interesting enough, one wonders what would happen if Henry May had been alive, and if you're not sure who I'm talking about, please go see the video I did that will come out on Tuesday of the same week as this, about Naval College at Greenwich. William Matthews, a civil engineer. Thomas Henry Holland, who was a geologist and was critical for geological survey in lots of those operations. Sir Thomas Edward Thorpe, who was a chemist and chief chemist of the government, as director of the government laboratory, this gentleman. Alexander Gracie, another influential thinker of his time. Humphrey Owen Jones, who was a Welsh chemist and mountaineer. And Alfred Yarrow. Now, if you've heard me talk about Yarrow shipbuilders in the past, you'll know that they are some of the most interesting engineers you can have. They're not quite as bad at Thornycroft for building a vessel which is a speed demon. I've often suggested that if the Americans would actually want to make the LCS a practical ship that would do 40 knots, they should make sure they should have given the design to Thornycroft. I don't think Thornycroft are still in the capability where they could have produced a ship the size of LCS. However, considering they'd merged with Vosper to become Vosper Thornycroft in 1966, and are currently owned in the UK by Babcock, the American ones, I think, are owned by the Jordan Company. Which does all sorts of interesting things. So, yeah, there was actually an option. There was actually a potential option for them to do the building. There's limited ability for it, but Thornycroft, other than Yarrow, known for producing insanely fast destroyers. So you've picked a group which are, in many ways, people would argue, none of them are coal people. And that's because people look at this and they fundamentally misunderstand the role of the Royal Commission on Fuel Engines. It's not about deciding the debate between coal and oil. That's been decided. They're going to have to transition to oil. The Commission is about implementation. The Commission is about the infrastructure. The Commission is about the realities of what you need to do to make this system work. And The trouble is, it's often dressed up as the debate of between coal and oil because at the time some people thought there was still a debate. Some people, especially those who were supportive of coal, were very much keen on that coal still has value, and coal does have value. Coal did have value. But once you're dealing with the realities of the actual logistics and infrastructure of using of an oil-based system, of all the systems that can be put around it, you're in trouble. Oil is going to win. And it's the problem we have today with replacing it. We have spent a century building up an infrastructure system based around oil, an entire lifestyle, entire civilization structured around oil and the gas as an addition. With coal as well also playing its part. And all these things have been built into the system by years of infrastructure investment. We have a very mature delivery system for oil and gas and all these systems, all these things today. And that doesn't mean they're not able to be disrupted. But it means they can absorb disruptions far better than, let me put it this way, the oil supply chain could absorb disruptions in the 1910s. When it was still brand new. So, there we go. The Royal Commission on Fuel and Engines. It's a funny old thing in some regards. Most interesting really comes down to the fact that when you start looking in the infrastructure, oil has the advantage you can set up pipelines. But whilst they can find New Zealand coal and various other coal in quite a large chunks of the empire, Britain has more difficulty accessing oil. And this is a big point of contention. It affects their resources, it affects their infrastructure, it affects how they're going to do it. It's one of the things which leads to the creation of British Petroleum, or rather Anglo-Persian Petroleum. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was purchased quite a large stake in 1914, 51%. But again, control the company, control access to the oil does not necessarily give you the oil. It's one of the things of, it's about secure. It seems to be a lot of the politics in this time period were focused on getting the first foot in the door, securing the first level of oil for global supplies. Not enough thought was given around the levels above that. They put in storage. They wanted to build that, but again, how do you get the oil from the fields to the storage? Well, the advantage of oil is you can build pipelines. I've already mentioned that, but I'm going to keep emphasizing it. You can build pipelines. And a pipeline is far easier to run than a railway. Liquids flow. If you add in pressure, if you're adding more liquid in at one end, it will keep flowing. Far easier than setting up a whole railway to move coal. Just look at how massive the infrastructure industry was established in Wales to support the Welsh coal industry in the 1800s. Look at that, 1860s, sort of 19th century, and that sort of period. As coal grows and as Welsh coal grows in usage, look at the sheer amount of infrastructure which needed to be chucked into Wales to get it out. Similar things happened in New Zealand, happened all over the world where you needed coal. Oil requires, in some regards, it's more efficient, therefore, to extract and maneuver. But you still need ships, because you don't have pipelines going everywhere. And also, pipelines are disturbingly easy to target in some regards when you're a nation state. They really are. So that was the infrastructure they were wrestling with. And you have Winston Churchill above all this. Winston Churchill is part of this. It's one of those strange things in that when we look through history, we can often find what the politicians claim. And it's curated documents, but they often leave their documents behind for posterity. Admirals are usually quite reticent, but you can find a fair number of admirals and captains' papers at various archives if you know where to look and if you go hunting for them. most of the chemists, academics, petroleum directors, all those people, if you can find their papers, good luck. This means you tend to get a curated perspective of the history because there's what documents and what the people remember. And whilst I don't necessarily agree with the phraseology that we all have our own personal truth, I do view that it does depend on perspective what events how events go. That what is your perspective on those events will tend to guide your interpretation of those events. That doesn't necessarily say the truth of what happens, that just means what you see of what happens and how you understand it. The truth is the truth. Perspective is a different matter. And the thing is, we get the sources we do provide us with a perspective they do when we go looking for them. Churchill is, though, involved because, to an extent, you need the front man to make the case. With the Royal Commission's support, he is making the case to the Treasury, he is making the case to the public. Because it's a large thing you're doing. Think about this. There hasn't been a similar infrastructure revolution in terms of the Royal Navy's operational capabilities at this point until you go back to copper bottoming. There's a reason I keep pointing out copper bottoming. That's the last time you have a change on this level. Coal had emerged. Coal had slowly displaced sail. But the thing is, they'd operate alongside each other, and in many ways, you hadn't had to rebuild an entire infrastructure system over it. Not as radical. It's an implementation of a new infrastructure system. It's not a radical change of an existing infrastructure system. And that is what the implementation of oil is. It's a massive change. And you do it because it takes the coal strategy and makes it better. It truly does make it better. It makes that whole resupply at sea viable. It makes all the things you've seen at Tsushima, the things you've seen with the Russians and the Great White Fleet and the various naval operations the British have done themselves, and suddenly makes it better. Makes it work. And that's something they have to think about. But it does change, to an extent, the perspective on the Queen Elizabeth class when we talk about them being oil-fired battleships. Yes, they're the first ones. Whoopee-doo. This is not what makes them amazing because, let's be honest, the stuff which is the oil-fired battleship, that's been coming for 10 plus years. They've been working on the infrastructure for the better part of a decade. By the time they're laid down in 1913, the Commission has been reporting for 3 years. It's reported in 1911, 1912, and 1913. And investments have been being made. They are a sign of what's coming. But they are a sign of what's coming in that it's already on its way. Not some future which is a potential out there. No, this is a technology which has reached a level at which we can now start investing in infrastructure. It hasn't reached maturity. But it's long past its nursery stages. Adolescence, maybe. Maybe that's what you describe. It's not yet in adulthood. But it's certainly adolescent. And that again changes your perspective on these ships from being quite so amazingly technologically, out there to, it's reached that point. Because as always is the way, when you're dealing with something like a capital ship, kind of like an aircraft carrier or anything today, If it breaks down, you get more than egg over your face. That can represent a national security issue. It can represent operations not being able to be done. It can represent your national image being sufficiently tarnished that people think war against you is a possibility. You don't take that risk. You also don't take the risk of investing so much money in such assets and then not being able to use them. There is an argument that actually Beatty makes at one point, which is based on the idea the reason he deserves to have the Queen Elizabeth is because coaling the battle cruisers takes so long it could actually impede his ability to respond. Because when the ships return from operations and need to be coaled, they are now out of action for days. Whereas the Queen Elizabeth class, the oil tender goes alongside, hooks up, they're filled. The rare good point made by Beatty, I'm presuming was done by a staff officer. I really do. But this leads us to a question. Once you start considering the oil issue and the transition more about infrastructure implementation than an actual debate, because when you consider the actual debate and the advantages for coal work out even better for oil, so oil seems to win the debate by default, despite unless there are people who are very, very pro-coal. Well, it changes your perspective on it. And so this is where the question comes in. Today's question is quite a fun one, I hope, is a simple one. What happens if the Royal Navy, if the Fuel Commission, etc., decides that infrastructure-wise, it's not yet there? How does it affect things if the Queen Elizabeth class are tried to be built as coal ships? How does it affect the world and the adoption of oil if the Royal Navy makes such a public statement that it doesn't have faith in it, despite investing it? And does it have an impact on World War One? Probably would have an impact on World War Two, but we'll leave that to one side. And what would that impact be? It'd be interesting to hear what you think it would happen if the Royal Navy basically decides that the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is not there and they can't have the money, don't have the money to invest or time to invest, they've got to concentrate on coal for now. What impact do you foresee it happening on World War One? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. What have we got coming up next week? We have the Paulette affair. That's going to be fun. Take care, thank you, and hope you enjoyed. Toodles.